Welcome to the Parts Watch invoicing series. In this tutorial, we're going to talk about sellers at point of sale. The seller is the employee who is tracked as having created the ticket. There are three ways to handle the seller: using the seller change setup on the Controls, Store, Invoice Options screen. Tracking the seller using the seller ID is optional. So if the seller change field is set to no, then the employee who is logged into the terminal is tracked as the seller for all sales and returns created at point of sale on that terminal. No further setup is needed, and regardless who creates an invoice, the logged in user is tracked for it. This method works for stores where a single counter person uses a terminal. But if more than one employee works off the same terminal, then a POS ID is able to track the sales and returns to the counter person who actually created them. In order to enable the seller ID, let's go from the menu to Controls, System, Employee Setup. And I have an employee already, and I'm going to click the Employee Security button. Now, normally employees are not able to make changes to their own information. However, they are able to create and change their seller ID for POS password. The system doesn't allow you to enter one, so you have to click one that's generated by the system. So click the Generate button until you find one that you're able to remember. Let's use this one. And now that we've created a seller, let's go back to the Invoice Options screen and see the other two choices for the seller change setup. If the field is set to Force, then a counterman identification window opens at point of sale each time a customer is found and each time the ROA button is accessed. This way, each invoice and ROA is tracked to the employee who created it, regardless which terminal it was created on and regardless which employee is logged into the application. The seller is the employee who starts the ticket, regardless what employee added parts to the ticket or finalized the invoice. Okay, now the third option is optional, because the seller adding the returns to a ticket may not be the same seller who originally sold them. The LISA transactions, invoice journal, and sales analysis reports may not correctly reflect the sales and returns per counter person. This can be a problem when commission is paid on net sales. And also, counter persons often make tickets called in by the sales team and need a way to change the seller to reflect the salesperson who sold the product. So, with the setting of optional, the seller button in the invoice screen is available and can be optionally selected to track the invoice to a seller other than the one creating the ticket. The seller button is only available using the Invoice Change Seller Security proc. Let's take a quick look at that. So the ability to change sellers can be set up per employee. For anyone not allowed, the seller field will display the logged in user, and that person will be tracked for the tickets created from that terminal. So the POS ID does not automatically open when a customer is brought into focus on the invoicing screen. Instead, the user must click the seller button and a pop-up opens to capture the seller that will be tracked for the sale or return. An application switch determines the pop-up that will open when the seller button is clicked. Depending on the setting, either the existing POS ID pop-up opens, the employee enters their or another counter person's POS ID, or the Please Select Employee pop-up opens and the employee enters their or the user ID and the password for the employee that will be tracked for the sale or return. The Browse on Employee Password prompt User Security Proc is used to determine whether or not the User ID button is available to open the Browse Employees window. To select a seller to track the ticket to. If permissions do not allow, the User ID field displays and allows entry of a valid user ID and password, but the user button is not available to find an employee. When the seller is selected, the seller field in the invoice screen displays the new seller. Once an item is added to the body of the invoice, the seller button is unavailable. The seller creating the return ticket is tracked if a return is created from invoice image. The user cannot change the seller before starting a return if a finalized invoice is opened from invoice image when the field is set to optional. Seller change functionality is available to virtual cash drawers, and the cash tendered is tracked to the changed seller. For real cash drawers, cash must be tendered when the seller is changed to an employee that is assigned to the drawer. For employee phone room, when permissions allow, the user can click the seller button and change the seller from the original store as well as from the selected phone room store, as long as items have not been added to the invoice body. The change seller functionality is also available to IWS stores and, of course, to regular stores. So, to sum up, if the change seller field is set to no, the logged-in user is tracked for all invoices per terminal. If set to false, then the POS ID is entered for each invoice and the system tracks the sale or return to the ID. And if set to optional, then the user must click the seller button in order to inform the system what counterperson to track to the ticket. And that's about it for change seller functionality. Please contact customer support if you have questions. And thank you for joining us.